By now, you are comfortable reading ISM controls without panic. You understand that controls describe expectations and outcomes, not technical instructions. This lecture builds directly on that foundation and addresses one of the most important and most misunderstood topics in the ISM mandatory versus conditional controls. At first glance, this distinction can feel intimidating. The word mandatory suggests absolute enforcement, while conditional sounds vague and negotiable. If you misunderstand this distinction, you can easily fall into one of two traps. Either over engineering security because you think everything is mandatory, or under protecting systems because you assume exceptions are easy to justify. The ISM is designed to avoid both extremes. When the ISM labels a control as mandatory, it is making a very deliberate statement. Mandatory controls represent the minimum baseline of security that the Australian government is not willing to operate without. These controls address risks that are considered unacceptable if left unmanaged. In other words, if a mandatory control is not implemented, the system should not be authorized for use. You should understand that mandatory does not mean one specific technical solution. It means the intent of the control must be met. Agencies may implement the control in different ways depending on their architecture or environment, but the outcome must still be achieved. Mandatory controls protect the foundations of trust, resilience, and accountability across government. Conditional controls work differently. A conditional control applies only when certain conditions exist. The ISM uses conditional controls to recognize that not all systems face the same risks and not all environments require the same protections. This is a practical reflection of the risk-based philosophy you learned earlier. When a conditional control applies to your system, it effectively becomes mandatory for that context. When the condition does not apply, the control does not need to be implemented. The challenge for you is not implementing the control blindly, but determining honestly and defensively whether the condition applies. This is where many beginners struggle. You might be tempted to interpret conditions narrowly to avoid work or broadly to avoid scrutiny. Neither approach aligns with the ISM. The ISM expects conditions to be assessed objectively based on system characteristics, business impact, and risk exposure. Understanding when a conditional control applies requires you to rely on the identify function you learned earlier. You must understand your assets, their criticality, and their confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements. Conditional controls cannot be assessed in isolation. They only make sense when you understand the system they apply to. Now comes the most sensitive part of this lecture: exceptions. The ISM allows exceptions, but it does not treat them casually. An exception is not a workaround or an informal agreement. It is a governed risk decision. An exception exists when a control, mandatory or conditional, cannot be fully implemented, but the system must still operate. In this situation, the ISM expects you to explicitly acknowledge the risk, document it, and have it accepted by the appropriate authority. This reinforces the governance principles you learned earlier. You should understand that exceptions are not failures. In government, they are often unavoidable due to legacy systems, operational constraints, or external dependencies. What matters is not whether exceptions exist, but whether they are transparent, justified, and actively managed. Risk acceptance is central here. When an exception is granted, someone with appropriate authority is saying, "We understand the risk and we accept it consciously." This shifts security from being an implicit assumption to an explicit decision. That transparency is one of the ISM's greatest strengths. It is also important to understand that exceptions are not permanent by default. The ISM expects residual risks to be monitored over time. Conditions change. Systems evolve. What was once unavoidable may later become addressable. This is why exception reviews and continuous monitoring are critical. Another misconception you need to let go of is the idea that exceptions weaken security culture. In reality, unmanaged exceptions do. Properly governed exceptions strengthen security by forcing honest conversations about risk, capability, and priorities. They prevent false confidence and silent non compliance. Mandatory and conditional controls also serve a practical purpose during assurance and audits. They allow assessors to distinguish between unacceptable gaps and managed risks. A missing mandatory control without an approved exception is a serious issue. A conditional control that does not apply, or one covered by an approved risk acceptance, is not. This distinction protects organizations and individuals. It ensures that people are not unfairly penalized for operating complex systems while still maintaining a high security standard. It also reinforces the idea that security decisions belong at the right level, not buried in technical teams. As you mature in your understanding of the ISM, you will notice that mandatory and conditional controls guide prioritization. They help teams focus on what truly matters first, rather than spreading effort thinly across every possible requirement. This makes security more achievable, not less. The key takeaway from this lecture is simple but powerful. Mandatory controls define the baseline, conditional controls adapt that baseline to context, and exceptions make risk visible and accountable. Together, they allow the Australian government to operate securely without becoming rigid or unrealistic. When you understand this structure, the ISM stops feeling like a blunt instrument. It becomes a framework that balances protection, practicality, and responsibility. That balance is exactly what government security demands.